Next up is approval of minutes from the August 12th. Those were circulated this morning. Understanding that they were circulated this morning, we can also table this to our next meeting if people don't have time.
I read them. If folks want to move on it, we can move. Otherwise, we can table it.
I read them too. They look good to me.
All right, Jason's
I-
nodding his head too. So I'll move that we accept the minutes from the last meeting.
I'll second.
Moved by the commissioner, seconded by the chief. Which chief? Who knows? Any additions, deletions, edits? Hearing none, all in favor, say aye. Raise a hand. Opposed, say nay. And we've approved our minutes. All right. So the fun one, establishing what our problem statement is. Has everyone had time to review all the documents that were circulated in preparation for these meetings? I'll pontificate for just a brief moment to say that this has been the age-old conversation that goes back 30, 40 years, probably before my time. And I'm not shocked to see us circle back around to the conversation again. My general sense is that in talking with members of this committee, as well as not members of this committee, people generally have a goal that they want to move towards, which is better training. I don't ever hear that as the opposition. It's usually what's the pathway to get there that then becomes the battle. So I'd like to hope that we can, as a group, come to a consensus on what we're trying to solve that can satisfy all the various different organizational needs, as well as the employer's needs and Vermonters' needs. With that, does anyone want to kick off an idea?
Hey, it's Rob. I did, at our last discussion, you had talked about the trade approach and having some, equivalence in baseline training and therefore expectations. That seems to me that's a good place to start. And then, later as you splinter off towards specialties, that makes that more adaptable.
Okay. Our overall mission of this group is to review the level 2 curriculum and address the liability issues that are related to that. I'm not sure that our problem statement necessarily needs to solve the liability issue, because I think doing the things actually solves the liability issue, and getting better training attached to learning objectives, attached to consistent curriculums. And so then it's a discussion of how we structure the level 2 program right now. I think that my personal opinion is that the trades model is more the solution to the problem statement, but I'm not quite sure it hits the problem statement. Would a fair starting point be something to the effect of, we have non-aligned or unaligned training models that splits resources and makes training less accessible for law enforcement officers?
I think I want to back up just one step before that, Mark. When the problem statement is focused on liability, I guess as a CEO, I say, but that's my problem, not yours. If the scope of a level 2 certification is X, and maybe, I read through the documents, and it's kind of, it seeps out at you that level 2 was never meant to be for full-time patrol officers, but that's exactly what it's being used for in many communities if you read the results of the survey, right? Perhaps the fix around liability is as simple as the council saying level 2 certification was never intended to be for people doing full-time patrol duties. And so it takes the council out of the liability cesspool, and it firmly puts it back on the person who employs a level 2 officer. So I'm just trying to be pragmatic about the fact that the question came to us as a how do we deal with the liability of the current level 2? That's not to say we shouldn't improve the level 2 training, because that report that Jason wrote is compelling and makes good sense, right? But at the end of the day, if the question posed to this group, this current group, was what to do about the liability, put a disclaimer into the council language somewhere in the rules around level 2, and put the liability right back on the people who employ them.
I think that makes sense. And one question I have is our mission to propose a redesign of level 2? Or are we simply agreeing we identify as a group, we say what the commissioner just said, which I think has merit, is that the council needs to make this decree that level 2 is not intended to be used. The disparities are such that level 2 can't be used as level 3. But I'm unclear if we are proposing a new curriculum.
Our
in
charge,
designing it.
yeah, our charge is to analyze the issues raised in the IADLS report and the TAC report, including deficiencies in training, liability for agencies and the academy, short-term and long-term solutions that provide defensible training while meeting the staffing needs of law enforcement agencies. So I think that one recommendation that the commissioner just gave is simply that. How do we address the liability issue from the council's perspective? And maybe it's as simple as that. I like it. But then I think we are also leaning on to the review of the overall curriculum. One thing that the executive director shared with me in a conversation leading up to this meeting was it makes no sense that we teach our firearms training in the level 2 basic training, but we don't teach our use of force policy until the phase 2 in service defensive tactics course. And why has that been bifurcated? Well, just because defensive tactics instructors are the one teaching the policy, and now that whole policy is owned by them, not the firearms instructors. So I think aligning some of our training with our implementation is a key piece, which I also think there's an opportunity for the council to say, if you're going to put us in charge of training, put us in charge of what the scope of practice is too, which is currently legislated as opposed to council defined.
We had over the years, as we discussed this in the TAC, which was literally over the years, we had this issue. So if they are doing the same job, why do they not have the same training? And as we looked at ways to make recommendations for level 2 training, we're always struck with this isn't an apples comparison. So if you are going to do the same job, as the survey indicates that many level 2s are, the TAC kept struggling with, well, the only way to do that same job is to do the same training. That's when we started looking at this alternative path idea. And it becomes complicated because it's easy for us to say there needs to be more training. But if level 3 spends, they fire 3,000 rounds or whatever it is on the range, level 2 fires 50. Well, level 2 needs to fire 3,000. Now we start creating the level 2s to start to look like level 3 because we kept circling back saying, how can we have level 2 if they have to have the same training? Isn't everything level 3 at that point?
It strikes me that there has to be multiple steps moving forward, and somewhere along the way, we just have to draw a line in the sand and say, effective this date, this is what level 2 basic training looks like. And I'm making this up out of whole cloth based on what I read, but that it's a 4-week instead of a 2-week commitment, so that you can add in some of the scenario-based training that was recommended in that report and some of the other, recommendations. And here is what the council expects the scope of practice to be. And I don't think I'd try to open the legislation. It's going to be a can of worms we're not really going to like, I think. But that starting at a certain level, moving forward, the level 2 training looks like X. But at the same time that we draw that line in the sand, we still haven't addressed the statutory requirement that requires us to use portfolio experiential learning or college level examination programs in order to transition to level 3. Our goal should be to elevate as many of the current level 2s that are practicing in the field to level 3 in a way that makes them proficient, right? So that we don't live in this in-between space of these people who only received 2 weeks initial training, et cetera, et cetera. So let the current level 2s who've been in the field for years and years get to a level 3 certification. And that doesn't mean requiring them to row or run or anything, because they're already in the field doing the job. So we're going to have to grandfather in a group. We're going to have to draw a line in the sand, and we're going to have to fulfill the mission that we were given that we haven't done, which is we already have this process, this thing that I just dropped in the chat. We already have the solution to this. It's called the waiver process. We do it for out of state people who are trying to come in, where we examine all of their training records and we write them a prescription for what they have to do to become a level 3 certified officer. And that's how we should deal with the cohort of existing level 2 officers, to move them to level 3, as many of them as possible. And then we have the newly structured level 2, and the council puts its imprimatur on it saying this is not intended for people who are primarily used in the patrol function. We don't have to say what it is intended for. We can say what it's not intended for, right?
Commissioner, I agree. And there is another TAC report circulating out there addressing that very issue, addressing that edict that there be a portfolio-based learning process. The TAC proposed to the council. No action was taken. There is now a second proposal that was done to allow 2Es, just those few level 2Es to transition, but the TAC proposed it for all level 2s. So that exists. That work was done.
So, sorry, I'm just gonna jump in. So I've seen the level 2E to 3, because I have a level 2E myself, and going through it, it's like almost impossible for him to do. They obviously they wanted him to go through the PT test and all that, and he's been on for 20 years as a level 2. At this point, he can't get off work to go do that type of stuff. He's willing to go into do the classes at the academy. But what the academy put in there as what they wanted from him is almost impossible for him to do. So I think that needs a little bit more. And Jen and the group that put that together did an excellent job. I just think there's some bumps in the road that we have.
Yeah, so what I've heard from everyone so far is really more the issue is the accessibility of training. If the level 2 needs to put 3,000 rounds downrange to be equivalent to the level 3, then to TAC's point, it just starts to look like level 3, but nobody's really saying that that's a problem. What we're saying is, how do we get them to do the 3,000 shots when the instructor's not available, the class isn't available, it's offered twice a year, it's offered 6 months after they had that one other class related to it?
That's a good point, Mark. And this, not the 2E transition process, the TAC dealt with just level 2s transitioning to level 3. We talked about the idea of having level 2s audit level 3 classes to get the hours that they needed. And at the time, the academy felt that might be cumbersome. And when we have a class as large as the current class, and with caps going forward, I don't know, especially with something as involved as range or use of force. We were looking at ways to try to accommodate that lack of accessibility to training.
So could that be our problem statement? How do we improve the accessibility to training? Or training is not accessible in its current form?
I think one of the other issues too is how do people who've been on the job get some recognition or experience on their resume for the time that they put in? Because a lot of this transition stuff is not accounting for the years that they've done the job. Even though they've been there and have training, how do you account for that?
You know, I want to be frank and say that I've not seen recently. If I did read it, it's gone. Sorry, but the transition from level 2E to 3, I didn't see it. But what I heard others say is that it's a very broad prescription. It's not specific to the person and their portfolio and their training records. We already know how to do a waiver process. We do it for everyone who comes from out of state. Why couldn't we do our own already certified at 2 or 2E level people the same level of courtesy of examining their records and writing a prescription for what they need? Then it's up to the agency to determine if they're willing to invest in that path forward. But what I think we have to get away from, when I talked about that line in the sand, where there at some point we just have to say, here's the line in the sand. Everyone who becomes a level 2 going forward has to go through again, I'm making it up, a 4-week academy, not 2 weeks or whatever it is. But in the meantime, we have this bolus of people, and I don't even know how many there are. I'm guessing it's not more than 100 in the state. Maybe I'm wrong. Kim or anyone know the answer? That want to do the job. They're in the field doing the job, and we should help them get to level 3. And we need to disabuse ourselves of the notion that becoming a level 3 certified officer when you've been in the field 15 years does not mean you have to go back through and somehow simulate being in the residential academy. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure they understand constitutional law, protecting civil rights, safely execute car stops and search warrants, that they know, how to write affidavits and testify in court. So we kind of have to take that bolus of people once we draw that line in the sand and facilitate getting them to where we want them to be to reduce liability generally and specific to each agency.
Just point of clarification, the 2E to 3 was originally recommended as a wholesale. It did not end up that way. It ended up with specific prescription based on individual capabilities. They were not willing to accept actual life experience, but were willing to accept courses and training. I provided a sample of a prescription that was submitted to the Academy for 2E to 3. They would only take, if you took a similar course, we'll grant you credit for that, but wouldn't take life experience. The state of Vermont does have a teaching certificate that accounts for life experience, just as a side note, that they individually look at examinations and records. And if you can essentially test out or show demonstration, you can achieve some teaching certificates. So there are other practitioners out there that utilize your ability to show that you can, meet the goals and objectives without having to actually take a course.
John, a question for you, just because I use this as my example. When we consider the 2E to 3 courses that a person has taken, so for example, we know ethics is a required course for all of our training programs. If I've taken a bachelor's level ethics course, would that be considered?
So under the 2E to 3 program, it was considered. For example, I shared with you an example of Robert Montgomery's prescription transcript. We used several classes that he took at Norwich University through his criminal justice program to supplement. The areas, though, that the Academy would not accept, for example, were crash investigation. He has a lot of experience in crash investigation. He had not taken an actual training course, but he'd taken one similar. So they did offer a test out for that option. There is an existing test at the Academy. If he can test out of that, he would not have to take it. But you will find there were some other classes that were not accepted. So under one of those was the case problems and evidence collection, their CSI class. He took those at criminal justice at Norwich. It didn't meet the same goals and objectives, so it was not considered for his prescription. But yes, there were, I think, 4 Norwich University classes that were considered in his prescription and accepted. The challenge is the time-consuming element of having to look at each course, what its objectives are, and if it matches with the Academy. I think it will become easier as the academy outlines the goals and objectives for its current curriculum. Will make it easier to see what that 2 to 3 transition would look like.
I just placed in the chat, I had to go back and look. This was a 2022 report. The TAC created a process for using CLEP, the portfolio model. And this wasn't original work. This had been done by a committee. We just plagiarized it. It was from 2019. And if you take a look at it, you'll see it requires, years on, hours on, things like that. It was, and then took class by class, and tried to make an equivalency for critical subjects, equivalency of training hours, just for certain topics. Again, I haven't read this since 2022, so I can't speak with any authority on it. But
And again, that's what teaching does now. You can get a teaching certificate through a portfolio. It's called Alt-5, Alternative 5 certification, that demonstrates. You still have to take a final examination, the teaching examination, but all the other things are waived if you can portfolio it out through experience.
the Academy had expressed, and it sounds just like what Jen is saying at the time, back in 2022, when we were discussing this, that it is very labor intensive reviewing these packets.
I will say the 2 packets we've reviewed thus far, I think each of those took somewhere around 24 to probably 40 hours amongst the group as a total. But those are initial packets. Once this starts to get established, I think it becomes easier. The challenge was because there were not clear goals and objectives for the curriculum at the Academy. It was more difficult. Once those are established, it'd be a lot easier.
And there's a parallel committee, the level 3 curriculum review, that's working on that. I know he's not here right now, but I know that Chris Burkell would say, as we make these recommendations to the council, we're also going to need to make recommendations of staffing and resources to do the things. So we should probably be mindful that whatever we do recommend in improving training should be very mindful of the costs and personnel dedicated to do the work.
A few thoughts in mind on that. Some of those classes will be able to, once we establish that they meet the goals and objectives, we'll just be able to drag them across. So some of those classes are held at the Fire Academy. Once we've approved that class as a crossover, it can just be dragged across. We could say schools that have like NEASC or New England Association of Schools and Colleges that they've been approved. Some of those we can just drag across. So I think that work will become less intensive as time goes on.
Do we have any idea how other states have tackled this? Back in 2021, I think this will be in the first TAC report. It addresses a number of states still had something equivalent to Vermont's level 2, but I think the IADList report said that there are even fewer now. I'm just curious what those states have done. If they've, how they must have had to deal with this to some level, and I'm curious how they've done it.
So I know Massachusetts had what they called the Bridge Academy. So they kind of had a auxiliary like weekend academy. And Massachusetts is different in that there's like oodles of academies. Each like, I'm not sure how they even district it. It's not really by county, but each area has its own academy that they'll sponsor. The state police have their own academy they sponsor. Some agencies use the state police academy. Some agencies make their own. And back in, I think, 2021, they forced everyone in that auxiliary or part-time certification to either get out or complete the Bridge Academy. And so the Bridge Academy then brought them up to their quote unquote level 3 standard. I know several people who attempted it. A few completed it, but my concern with the model was basically they said, we'll just get rid of people. And I think that we are in too critical of a state, no pun intended, too critical of a state in the workforce right now to say we're going to just show 30% the door and accept that as a loss. But beyond Massachusetts, I don't know. But if we're already accepting college courses as alternative pathways, we're already using a waiver process that acknowledges different experiences, different training from different places. It seems to me that if we could build I'm not sure if it's if this committee, if the council, but the royal we build a framework in which we can say these are things that meet our learning objectives and these are ways that you can accomplish it. That could lead towards a level 3 certification. And so in that regard, if it's, hey, I'm going to shoot 50 bullets of ammo this year, and next year I'm going to do 1,000, and the year after that 1,000, and the year after that 450, and that gets me to the made up 3,000 that we've illustrated. Maybe there's a way that we can make these trainings accessible with regionalized instructors certified through the council, with making some of our curriculum available in distant learning models. One thing I know that we haven't really had at the academy, I think Cindy Taylor Patch was the last version of it. I'm not sure it's fair to say that she was responsible for it, but she was the only curriculum coordinator. We don't really have those. Is that still accurate, Chris?
That is still accurate to a degree. I mean, Ken is the director of training, and he's essentially coordinating all the training that's there now, but it's all being reviewed. So, you know, until we get through that process and make sure that the curriculum that we're teaching has all the learning objectives and the testing that we can show that it's legitimate, we'll have a much better handle on that. But then, you know, even the feedback that we get from my analysts already is that we need to have that just a curriculum development person as a position. They're saying two, like, I'm thinking of reality, but yeah, I mean, they definitely say that we need a curriculum person for a position person. And I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your conversation. Was going from a level 2 to potential level 3 through waiver process.
We discussed the level, just a very quick recap. We've discussed the level 2E to 3 and our waiver process and how we acknowledge training in other places in other ways that we have already been exercising. And then briefly, we discussed the 2022 TAC report that was exploring the concept of a level 2 to level 3. So I think that's about where you came in, but we've been kind of meandering through solutions and problems.
Well, we will very likely at the next academy class have our first level 2E to level 3 participant going through. And he does have quite a complete packet, and years of experience. And, you know, thanks to Chief Frank and others putting that process together of what that looks like and saving our one individual who goes through all the waiver applications. That process was very helpful in getting that. But there again, this was not a cheapening of that process. This was a process to make sure that even though this person has years of experience on the job, still coming back to, you know, actually perform things that we know that he hasn't done over a number of years. And simply because you're practicing in law enforcement doesn't necessarily mean that you have all the metrics that you should. But this is a great candidate willing to do everything and come back and test out. That certainly is a good process. I don't think that there are many of those in the system that either one have the desire to do that, or two have the amount of training and experience in their level 2 functions currently.
I think one of the things that frustrates me about I guess the way we've been thinking about this, or at least the way I've been thinking about it, is that we're just trying to build one path forward to go from level 2 to level 3. But, you know, in my experience, not all level 3s are built the same. And I can say that from experience leading agencies. the type of work that police officers in Burlington do bears zero resemblance to what a trooper does on a day-to-day basis. The only resemblance it bears is that they wear uniforms and carry guns. The degree of de-escalation, verbal communication, community problem solving that is happening in a more urban environment is not at all the same as what's happening when you are the only trooper around for 30 miles. And it feels to me like we're not thinking out of the box hard enough to say, we have this group of people that are sort of stuck in the middle. The path forward to level 3 is too much, I guess, unless we find a way to meet the needs of getting them to a competency that matches the work they're supposed to be doing. I was surprised when I read that survey to find out how many of the level 2s are basically their primary job is patrol. That surprised me because that's clearly not what the level 2 certification was intended for. But how do we get them in a creative way that matches the reality of the work they're going to be doing? And again, that would be agency specific. And I know people move from agency to agency, but how do we build a flexible enough path from level 2 or level 2E to level 3 that the agency can support it and that it does not create such a rigid cookie cutter that everyone must do X? There's certain baseline things, of course, but the whole package I'm trying to encourage that we be as adaptable as we can be to move as many people forward as we can with a degree of reasonableness.
I can appreciate what you're saying, Commissioner. I do agree. Agency specific is very different in the delivery of what that officer does for their community. And I also agree that there are certain baselines that we know that every officer should be able to meet, such as being able to defend themselves or somebody else. And that just kind of goes without saying. But I think one of the things that we have seen already is that we might find, I shouldn't say what we've seen already. These are the things that we have to address, that somebody doesn't go through a level 2 process with the intent of going to that agency and doing a specific job, and then 6 months later goes to a completely different community where they are not prepared to do what they should be doing because we've, morphed that process into. That's the key, right? Is finding what is it that we can have somebody go through that encompasses enough for them to be able to know wherever they go and still have the core competencies that they would have to know to defend themselves and their communities.
I also think that we need to be careful with words. Just referencing the survey, I know that I have probably 3 deputies who would say that, yes, they do patrol. And what that means from their perspective versus from my agency's perspective are wholly different. And so the one person who went out on a governor's or state highway safety saturation patrol along with 4 other people, well, they were on patrol, but they're not slinging calls, they're stopping cars. They stood at a checkpoint with 4 other deputies, troopers, and officers. And it's low risk. And some of that I think is missed when we talk about the nebulous patrol. And so that's where, Commissioner, I hear your shock with the number, but also I'm not sure that the quantitative gives us the qualitative answer. This is where, to me, and when I've pitched my train model that I've said before, one of the things I was trying to look at is how do we align our instructor cadre of level 2 and level 3, because they are separate curriculums right now. And I think it makes more sense broadly that they follow the same path. And so criminal law should be the same from level 2 to level 3, even if it were at a lower level of Bloom's taxonomy of learning in level 2. And then what's the next step to get the person to that level 3 competency? Well, they need to have the curriculum. And so if we could avail more instructors and we can avail more academy time in whatever format that is, distance learning, in person, regionalized training. But if we could have a core curriculum that delves the deeper level of level 3 later in the process that a current person could accomplish maybe in 2 years' time, versus the you need to commit to the 19 weeks in Pittsburgh, figure it out. We don't care what your life circumstances are that are prohibiting that, which is kind of the model we have right now. So maybe we're tap dancing around one of our goals, which is to say we want to see people attain higher level certifications. Is that a goal of ours?
I would think it is that we want more people, as many people as possible, trained at the highest level. But I think you'd have to ask, like, go ask a sheriff's department that relies on level 2 people if that's really their goal. They might be like, no, my goal is being able to do the services that I need to do in my county at the reimbursement rates that the towns voted at town meeting day. And I can't pay people at the rates that a level 3 officer would be, but we still got to get the job done. So I have to use level 2 people because I can pay them less.
Yeah, and just anecdotally, having spoken with several sheriffs, a lot of them have said, I don't care how much training they need to do. I just need them to be able to get to it. And if I can't get them to it, then they can't do it. And so there's like frustration when it's like, hey, I have a level 2 provisional that needs the CSI class. They were sick on the day that it was delivered. And so we're waiting 6 months for the next CSI class because we have, I don't know how many instructors right now, but let's say it's 2. And we're pulling all of our instructors from the existing workforce, which is already, in many agencies' cases, intensive. So expanding our instructor base and expanding the accessibility to the trainings, aligning the trainings with the work that people are doing.
So should that be a goal, which I agree with, is getting more people, more training, achieve more level 3 certifications through whatever path? Where does that leave us with our group assignment for those level 2s that aren't ready for that? That either aren't interested or unable or don't have the experience yet. They're new to the job. We are still going to have level 2s. Are they still going to have, well, they'll still have the same scope of authority. But that when we speak of the liability concern, that line in the sand that the commissioner mentioned, the new level 2s, where do they fall? It's great to say that we take somebody that's been, level 2 certified doing the job for 20 years and we try to identify a way for them to become level 3 certified. That's wonderful. That's great. But there will still be a bunch of level 2s not eligible. Do we have to address that?
What prohibits the eligibility?
Well, I'm saying, like, say this is somebody that's only been level 2 for a year and maybe isn't interested. Maybe they truly are working part-time. So their scope of practice will still be the same. Is that what the Atlas report most recently addresses, is that disparity in training given their scope of practice? Do we have to tackle that? That's my question. It's not a statement, it's a question.
From a liability standpoint, I think we have to, because whether you work 1 day a week, 1 day a month, or 40 hours a week, you don't know what you could come across or be called to at any given time frame. And I think that's the challenge. Is the goal would be, even if folks say, well, I don't want to be eventually level 3 certified, I think here is the standard we're all going to get to. And even if it's going to be a piecemeal, like you're level 3 certified and now you take dead body investigations, now you have more certification and more capability. I don't think we can say, well, I'm just part-time, I'm only going to work 1 day a week. That's where that liability is. You never know what you can get called to.
Yeah, I agree with Jen. So just for an example, when I first started back in the 90s, we'll leave it at that. Part-time was strictly part-time. You couldn't work over 20 hours a week without going to the full-time academy for like 4 weeks in a row. You could fill in for vacations once in a while, but the limit was on the time, and your scope was only limited by the training that you've taken. I think we did ourselves a bit of a disservice when they changed it to limit the scope on level twos, but allowed them to work 40 hours a week, with no barrier, because that's allowed. And I'm one that uses level twos for my patrol and to cover shifts and 40 hours. I have a 2E and he works full time, so my department wouldn't run without them. So I got it, but I think that was one of the issues is when they allowed them to have 40 hours a week. That's when we started using for full-time work because we could.
I'll say completely agree, Loretta, that I'm going to reiterate a point I've made before, which is that I think it's insane that a level 2 can't investigate a burglary, but a level 3 can say, I'm not coming.
I agree with you.
And that's statutory. Like that's not for us to say we're changing. I think the council can adopt curriculum and expand the scope of authority if they've had training on it. And that might be something we can explore, saying, could we identify level 2 accomplishes this base level of training? So right now it's a 2-week course. Let's pretend we just keep it within the 2 weeks worth of training, but one of those weeks becomes the defensive tactics and firearms class. And we move what's currently in that phase 1 into in-service training. It's not necessarily changing at least the level of training that we're providing. We're just moving it to different places. But then we can be more holistic in saying, what do we expect a level 2 to do? We have our line in the sand saying these aren't intended to be patrol people. This is how they can expand on their level 2 curriculum toward that level 3 path, which even if they do 90% and they're closer to level 3, but they don't do level 3, they're still better trained. So maybe what our next task should be is to take the I call it the list of 800 tasks. I don't know how many really are on it, but what IADLS came up with from that survey, and we go through that and make a recommendation of this is what we believe the phase 1 of level 2 should be. This is what we believe phase 2 should include as required courses. And then these are add-on certifications that they could get that expand their scope of authority. Like here's burglary investigation class. Here's DUI. Here is, I'll even say death investigation school. I mean, I had an assistant medical examiner who knew more about dead bodies that was level 2, and I was the one who could sign off on it as a level 3. I thought that was insane. I even asked my state's attorney, do you really want me to be the one approving this case, or should I find someone who knows what they're talking about? Because I've never gone to death school.
I think if I can chime in, and I'm sorry, late to the game. Jen and I were off doing other tasks earlier. But I wonder if, and reflecting back on what you said, Loretta, if when the change was made, if whomever made that change, and I don't even recall that far back, if we didn't kind of create a kerfluffle that we're now saddled with, and that is, I think clearly, at least my time in Barre when I used then part-time officers, there were police officers that I knew only wanted to direct traffic at details. They only wanted to work high school basketball games and maybe work a governor's highway safety detail. They go out and chase some speeders. And that's all they were ever going to do. So is there, and it's, I'm sure it's too many things happening all at once here, and I've said this before, so I'll say it one last time, is there a need for, a new certification that it's like, we're going to train you to the scope of your authority, and have something new created that these are just detail officers. These are just the officers that are going to provide those very rudimentary functions in a community. And maybe it's working for a sheriff's office, work in a contract where they just provide, traffic control in a community, and that's all you need. And maybe they're going to transport some prisoners, and maybe they're going to work a traffic detail on the highway, but that's all I need. They're never going to go out and respond to calls. So, that might be a smaller, when we look at that scope, they don't need, 6 weeks of training. They maybe only need 2 or 3, versus what, Loretta's speaking of, some of those level 2, part-time, whatever we want to call them, officers that are like, no, I need the capability to respond to calls. I need to run a full shift all by myself and look out at what that scope authority will be, and reflect on, ask ourselves, and how much training is it going to take to get them to that, justifiable ability, training and knowledge to say, yes, they are capable of, handling these situations. And from a liability standpoint, I think that will hopefully speak to some of that, is that if the only thing this officer is assigned to is run a radar, then from a liability standpoint, a small number of hours training might be sufficient, but they're limited from doing anything further, versus going out to this full, what we currently have for the level 2 scope of authority, is to really sink into that. And as you say, Mark, looking at what are those, those elements that they need to know, as pointed out by Atlas, to try to wrap arms around. And what does that training curriculum look like? What does that training plan look like to get them there? And you're right, Mark. I mean, there may be an opportunity to maybe not expand the number of hours in facility. Maybe that's retooled, but we look at, what is it? I think it's 50 hours now, additional training beyond the field training. Maybe that's reconfigured. Maybe it's expanded a little bit. It's going to take you more than 50 hours. Granted, there's a huge challenge of how do we get those things that are required? How often and where are they offered? And maybe that's something we can try to look at.
Here's a thought in line with that, Trevor. What about creating a patrol school? I mean, we build out patrol procedures, we build out defensive driving, we build out criminal law, motor vehicle law, similar to what level 3 drives toward. And then going back to what the commissioner started with, we say as a council, this level 2 is not expected to be patrol, but the patrol school could be that certification that says we're teaching them the things. And that could be a 2-week course. I'm making up, I have no idea how many weeks, but that could be a course that could be offered. Jason.
To Trevor's point, I think it's valid to take a look at level 1 for those purposes, for court officers, for transport officers. But more specifically to level 2, maybe to address some of the liability aspect, where it seems like we're unanimous in agreeing there should be more training, but departments need these level 2 officers. What if we lengthen or enhance the provisional status of that certification? Meaning, at the completion of the current prescription, maybe you don't have the ability to do everything yet. Maybe your provisional certification lasts longer. I don't know how that impacts departments. I don't come from an agency with level 2 officers, but maybe I'm misremembering this, but back in the past, didn't level 2 only have authority in the presence of a level 3 officer? Now it's a full-fledged level 2. I thought there was a time when, okay, but maybe we look at things like that. Maybe until the level 2s achieve more training, giving more time, because we do have an accessibility issue. We look at things like the patrol school, that level 2s can't just operate as independently. Maybe that helps us address the liability. Just a thought.
Chris?
Yeah, while all of these comments are legitimate, I think what I would like to stay away from is, we're already talking about training to certain degrees or to certain levels of, why don't we do this for patrol, or why don't we do this for whatever else somebody needs. You have to remember that part of the scope of practice came to be because of the fact that there were people that had different levels of certification and didn't have qualifications to do certain things. And that was not fair to the communities at large that see somebody in a uniform and expect that officer to be able to do whatever the call is that they might be required to do. So you can say, I have a guy I'm only going to use for patrol. That doesn't matter if somebody has a robbery going on and they see that patrol guy standing there in a uniform and expects some level of service to be provided to them. So when I was a part-time person back in my day, and so Loretta, I'm older than you, but it was, for me, it was 30 hours that you could work. And then the last 10 hours had to be administrative, but I could do anything. I could do anything that a full-time certified officer could do, which is scary because I had at that time 1 week of training, and they put me in a car with somebody else and said, go out and arrest people and do whatever it is that you do. I had my very first DUI fatality that I prosecuted, that I arrested the person was as a part-time officer. So like, when you think about that today, that's crazy, right? But like, we have to remember that where this level of certification came from was as a result of communities not being able to have a peace of mind when they see an officer that they know that officer can do the job. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't have differing levels, but we can't say that I want to use somebody for this and they get to a certain level and now all of a sudden they go to another agency and they have a whole different scope of practice of something that they may not have the training for. That's the one thing, like, I want to be just a listener here, but I just don't want people to lose track of that component to that.
Loretta?
The other thing I don't want us to forget about is when we all do put the uniform on, it doesn't matter what we're doing, we can still get in the shit. No matter what, even if you have somebody that's just doing governor's highway safety, traffic stops can turn into bad real quick. So I think honestly, everybody should be trained to the most of our capabilities, regardless of their, and I get that's not realistic because we do need, level 2s and, but yeah, that's it.
And I agree, and I think that should be everyone's goal, is as much training as possible. But this model already exists in EMS. You see an ambulance staffed by people, some of those people in that ambulance are only certified at basic life support levels and can't even start an IV, can't administer medication. So, I mean, you get who comes to you. I'd love for us all to be level 3, but I don't think that's going to work here. But I think we need to enhance our training.
Anthony?
I just think there's certain things, irrespective of scope and what you're allowed to do, that you could end up getting into. Certain things should be taught identical to level 3, such as firearms. And this 50 hours, no matter what, if I'm creating a level 2 officer, they're going through a full process of field training. So I just think that certain things you can I could choose to make it so that an officer is not working alone or that they're not going to go to a death investigation, but I can't choose whether that person is going to be able to or going to get in a situation where they have to use a firearm.
Rob?
Yeah, I would completely concur in the discussion. One of the drivers behind the level 2 certification in my arena is frankly economy for departments, because it allows people to get law enforcement certification to an extent that allows them to work, in this case, in the judicial spaces. So while that's fine, one of the things that keeps me up at night pretty much every week is that we have people who are in these roles that are not battle tested, and they may not have the depth of training and certification that, just, as Jennifer pointed out, you're wearing the same patch, you're the same expectation. And so we're screening for weapons and various things within the building, but if I've got law enforcement in the courts, I've already got guns in the buildings. I just need, 1 or 2 malcontents to overtake, someone who's, got the level 2 training, but, maybe they didn't spend the time on weapons retention or those sorts of things. So that you know, there's definitely a concern there to get a baseline expectation. We also tell in some of our courts that, you know, the direction is stop, hold, and detain and pass off to law enforcement. And that's risk driven. You know, and I get a lot of pressure for people saying, well, we need armed people in the buildings. I said, well, then they don't understand, you know, close quarter battle. They don't any of those dynamics where, you know, gunplay within a space is so, you know, high risk, and it requires a mature law enforcement, battle tested, battle trained, at least to the extent that we can get it, to have, you know, have that reasonably, you know, it's never going to go well, but it's something that, you know, we have to get closer to. I will say though that many of these individuals who are interested in being in these court roles are also highly thirsty for training access. So I would absolutely support to what extent that we can get a training standard that meets you know, the council's needs, you know, in satellite access. And, you know, how we do that, you know, is this ongoing discussion, but there's very much a need for that. And I know that the level 2Es are very thirsty for these training opportunities.
So we got 2 minutes left of our allotted time. I really appreciate this discussion. Is there any burning thing someone wants to throw out before we go to public comment? Anthony?
I was just gonna say that I think I know there's some states that there's like a patch issue to level 2s, level 1s, not level 3s, but I find it problematic that our officers don't know that what the scope is of a particular person, and it would be nice if we had something to remind them that hey, this person's a level 2, and similar to medical, how we have a patch for EMT, EMRs, and AEMTs, where you arrive on scene and you could say, okay, I know this person's scope is not what mine is, and that they can't do everything. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, it's actually one of the issues we deal with a lot is we'll have level 3 officers trying to pass level 2 from different agencies, level 2's cases. It's like they can't do that. And it's almost always a phone call between me and the agency head saying like, this is why, and there's a lack of understanding. So totally acknowledge that. All right. Any comments from members of the public? Hearing none, unless anybody wants to say anything else, be looking for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll
All right,
second
moved
it.
by Jason, seconded by Jen Morrison. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. All right, appreciate your work, everyone. Good to see you. Happy Monday.
Thank you.